I'm the higher degree research coordinator for humanities. So I deal with a lot of the applications for funding for PhD scholarships for international students, domestic students, and also there's another scholarship that the university has that my job as HDR coordinator is to try to get our students as positioned as strongly as possible in those competitive application rounds. So having just come through a major ranking of scholarship applications for the humanities students, I thought I might talk about a little bit about how our own students as undergraduates might be thinking of strategizing so that they can get one of these scholarships for their PhD studies down the track. Now, the PhD scholarship program in Australia has changed last year, I think it was. It used to be funded by the Australian Research Council, the ARC, but that has now shifted to a different government agency, the Department of Education and Training. The scholarships work the same way, funded by a different branch of the government, and they are now called the Research Training Program Scholarships, or RTP. All right, so that's the term, the acronym that you hear a lot in the context of PhD scholarships now. The way the scholarship works is you get a stipend for the 3 years that you're studying for your PhD. And that, I think, this year is about $26,000 a year. Not a huge amount of money, but you can live on that, especially if you're a starving student. Certain universities, well, I think all universities have a program where the university will also kick in money to support your research. Now, how much gets kicked in on top of that is going to depend on which discipline you're in. And unfortunately, archaeology in most universities is not in the hard science end of the university where a lot of the money is. We tend to be in the humanities and ancient history, things along those lines. For at University of New England, for instance, the students will get their yearly stipend, their living allowance, this is PhD students, but they'll also get $1,000 a year to support their research, so $3,000 over the course of their 3 years of study for the PhD. Other universities, much more generous. For instance, Griffith University, which I looked into recently, has you get your RTP scholarship in one of two different programs. If it's an A-level scholarship, they'll chip in $15,000 over the 3 years. That's $5,000 that you can spend on things like computers, printing, internet access at home, all that kind of stuff. That's on top of your living allowance that's given to you by the government. Their Class B scholarships is still $9,000 over the course of the 3 years, so that's $3,000 a year. So once you add that into it, and different universities are going to have different levels of generosity in terms of the university support. It's quite a nice chunk of change there for getting you through your PhD studies. And I should say as well that there's no HECS involved in that. The tuition fees are paid for by the government. So really it's a free program if you're able to get that, and they give you a stipend to live on. How do you do that? Very competitive, okay? The research training program it's the gold standard in Australia for higher degree research scholarships, all right? So as you can imagine, very competitive. The way that UNE approaches how to give those scholarships out to different universities is there's actually a rubric that we fill out. That's filled out by each school for the applicants that are coming through that school. As an undergraduate, you can strategize what you're doing now to make you maximally competitive if you do want to go on for your PhD, and that's something you probably should be thinking about as an undergraduate. You know, is this something that I want to extend and take it to the highest level? Think about it. Now, the way the rubric works at UNE, and different universities do this differently, so it's not going to be the same if you applied to a different university necessarily, but there has to be an empirical way that the university can evaluate between the candidates applying for this, because they want the ones that are most likely to finish. The rules have changed a little bit in recent years. It used to be that universities got money based on HDR enrollments. It's shifted now to HDR completions. So the university doesn't get paid until the student actually walks out the door of their degree. As you can imagine, then the impetus is on the university to really get those students in there who are likely to complete. How is that judged? All right, when you've got, I think there's 150, 160 students in the last round of the RTPs for maybe 40 scholarships on offer. So very competitive. How do you evaluate between those students to figure out who is most likely to finish? You look at their track record. All right. Now, the way the degree works here, as you guys are all aware, at UNE, it's a 3-year undergraduate degree, and then the next step is your honors year. Okay. Now, the way the system is structured, and this goes back for at least a decade, maybe even longer, is that the gold standard for getting one of these RTP scholarships is having a first-class result in your honors year. All right. You can also potentially get the degree, or get the scholarship, I should say, if you have a 2-1 result. And so if you get a 2-1, it's not the end of the world. You still could potentially get one of these scholarships. But first-class honors, you get the full 10 points in that rubric for that. Okay, it's considered the gold standard at the current time for setting yourself up for at least being in the running for one of these degrees. Now, the way the rubric works at UNE is another section that's fairly heavily weighted is publications. All right, and this is kind of a new thing that's happening where the whole publish or perish thing has been around for decades. But as we get more and more into the government's expecting positive returns on investment in higher education, one way that they can measure that empirically is by how many publications that our department puts out, for instance. So I suppose it's sort of a natural progression to think about when you're evaluating different students applying for these scholarships. How do you differentiate them? Well, this guy's got a publication, or this woman is, she's written a book chapter. If you think you've got a really good idea, or you've got something that you want to develop into a publication, start talking to your lecturers at the undergraduate level. We actually have ways that you might be able to work some idea that you have, or an idea that one of your lecturers has, into a small publication through for instance, at University of New England, we have the HUMS 301, which is sort of an independent study thing that you take on with a lecture. They might have a little project that you can do, get a good result. These are small projects, but you might be able to publish it somewhere. Okay, that publication then, looking good when it comes to doing the rubric, because if you've come out of your undergraduate degree, or even talking before honors here, you have a publication, that's looking really good. It's showing that you know how to do research. Not only that, but you can also follow it through to a scholarly completion. Completion, there's that word again. The way the rubric works, it doesn't matter where that publication appears. It has to be peer-reviewed, but the way the UNE rubric works at the current time, doesn't matter what that's published in. For instance, in this last round, we had a student apply from overseas who he's a second author on a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in America, which is considered one of the top 3 science journals in the world. All right? He gets a certain set of points in the rubric based on that. Same set of points if you were the second author on an article in the Journal of Australasian Folklore or something like that, which doesn't rank up in those same echelons, but it is a peer-reviewed publication, counts the same. So you don't really need to be worried too much about the profile at this stage, at the really early stage of your career. It's more important that you show that you can publish and that you've been successful doing that. Now, in your honors year, the honors year is it's a year-long study where you're focused entirely, this is full-time study, entirely on that one research question. And we would anticipate that you can get a publication out of that by the end. And really the whole rationale behind that year of study in your honors is to show that you are capable of initiating, developing research, and getting to that the final publication at the end of it. That's sort of the rationale here. If you can do that in your honors year, that's great. So, because what that does then is first class honors or even a 2-1, a couple publications, you're going to be fairly competitive in the RTP scholarship ranking. There are two other things I want to mention. One of them is experience. Another aspect of the way that the UNE ranking tool works is keep very close track of any kind of experience that you've gotten in, like if you've worked for a consulting company for a few months, write that down, exactly start end times of your employment so that you can accumulate months and years of experience that you can point to, because an aspect of the rubric is points for experience in the field, chosen field of study. All right, so that's again boosting your chances of getting a scholarship just a little bit more. And then the other thing I want to talk about is we've talked about publications in peer-reviewed journals. There is another type of publication called a non-traditional research output. For instance, if you're working at a consulting company and you're given the task of writing part of a contract report, for instance, you have to do the chapter on flakestone tools or something. Keep close track of that because that can count as a non-traditional research output. It's non-traditional in the sense that it's not peer-reviewed, but it's still doing research in your area. And those can count just as well as something that's published in a peer-reviewed paper. So if you are in a peer-reviewed journal. So if you are doing that sort of work already, or if you have the opportunity to do that sort of work, if you're volunteering for a consulting company or you're working for part-time for a consultant, by all means take all advantages of writing aspects of those technical reports. If you're asked, can you write this up? Don't go, oh no, I'm not a good writer, I don't want to do that, or it's just boring or whatever. Do it, all right? Because you can possibly count that as a non-traditional research output. Other things you can do would be, this is getting a little bit in the gray area for archaeology, but if you write a blog, for instance, that can be considered a non-traditional research output. And the reason that there is that category is more for the arts. If somebody does a play or whatever and they need to use that for their studies in arts, then they can count that as non-traditional research output, but it does have this scope in the context of what we're talking about here, getting your profile up to set yourself up for an RTP. Another one to think about might be a conference poster. You may not feel confident when you're first starting out of doing a full presentation at the Australian Archaeological Association conference, for instance, but you may feel comfortable doing a poster on some aspect of something you're interested in or something you've researched. Do it. Poster sessions are great. You can count that as an NTRO. So the whole idea here is that as an undergraduate, you can start thinking strategically about things you might do, going the extra mile, and just getting yourself set up professionally with a bit of a track record and with the aim of getting yourself in a position where you'll be competitive for these RTP scholarships coming out of your honors year.